and welcome to our latest EAU Global Outlook video. My name is Agathe Demarais and I'm the Global Forecasting Director at the EAU. I'm joined today by two of our analysts, Abhijit Surya, a senior analyst in our Latin America team, and Bikarski, an analyst in our Europe team. And today we're going to talk about convergence in Latin America and Europe. And the reason why we're going to discuss this today is because we have just published a special website and white paper for our 75th anniversary here at the EAU. The year 2021 is really a special one for us. And in this special report, we present our views on convergence and whether it has been successful or not in Europe and Latin America. And this is what we're going to discuss today with our experts. So, Abhijit, I'm going to turn to you now first to discuss the convergence question from the Latin America angle. So, despite the region's considerable economic potential, it looks like we are quite pessimistic about the region's outlook. Why is this?
Hi, Agathe. Thanks so much for the question. And you're right, we are not particularly sanguine about the outlook for Latin America's convergence with the developed world, right? And unfortunately for Latin America, what we've seen is that the past is prologue, and in recent decades, the region has had a tendency to slide from one crisis to the next. And there's honestly not any shortage of examples. We can talk about the region-wide debt crisis in the 80s, the Mexican peso crisis of 94, the Argentinian banking crisis of 2001, and so on, right? There are a number of factors which have made Latin America a crisis-prone region, and they include the repeated implementation of inconsistent macro policy, and over-dependence on commodity rents, and high and inefficient levels of public spending. So, these factors have basically weighed on Latin America's growth outlook for decades. What happened was years down the line, when the next major crisis to hit, the next major global crisis to hit, the COVID crisis, when it hit, Latin America was adversely affected. Its pandemic response was weighed down by cripplingly high rates of labor informality, inadequate healthcare systems, low levels of financial inclusion, and massive wealth and income inequality. So the COVID crisis basically laid bare all of these structural deficiencies in Latin America's fundamentals. And even though policymakers are now looking to correct course, we think they will face major hurdles in doing so, not least because they have to deal with powerful vested interests, they have to deal with entrenched corruption in the state, and they have to contend with weak institutional capacity.
Thanks a lot, Abhijit. When it comes to crisis, perhaps very briefly, because it's something else that we discuss on our EAU at 75 website, Venezuela tops the charts. Would you say that this was foreseeable?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, so Venezuela is definitely one of the more interesting case studies in the region. And I think it's fair to say that there were a number of warning signs along the way, but the sheer scale of Venezuela's economic collapse, the associated refugee crisis, it's the largest in the world now, surpassing the Syrian crisis, and the country's descent into like an absolute dictatorship caught most observers, and that includes ourselves, by surprise, right? So because what happened is basically, Venezuela went from being one of the richest countries, not only in the region, but in the world, in just as recently as the 1970s. And it had this robust democratic tradition, and all of that went down the drain because now Venezuela is approaching what is a de facto failed state. And there was a brief while when we thought that Venezuela's hyperinflation-riddled economic catastrophe, in conjunction with this maximum pressure campaign by the US, would produce regime change. However, what happened was that through coercion and repression by state forces, Mr. Maduro basically come to power, and he now presides over what is a much poorer, more unequal and smaller country. And I think this sort of ties back to implications for the region more broadly, where we see that the important roles played by political culture and democratic institutions in determining a country's long-term trajectory.
Thanks a lot, Abhijit. We're going to move to Europe now with you, Mario. So taking a look at Europe, we had a fantastic graph that was very popular from our white paper about the convergence of Southern European and Eastern European countries with core EU members. So Mario, can you tell us a bit more about the story behind this graph?
Of course, thanks, Agathe. So when we're talking about convergence in Europe, we're focusing mostly on the countries in Southern Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Eastern Europe, the newer EU member states. For our graph, we also included the countries in the Western Balkans, such as Serbia, North Macedonia, Albania, because these countries have aspirations to join the EU. But whether that will happen remains a big question. So we were looking at these as well. Now, what we are seeing from this graph is that convergence in Europe, if we have to sum it up in one sentence, it has been disappointing and it has been far below expectations. If we look at Southern Europe, for example, we are using Germany as a benchmark to compare with Western Europe. So if we compare GDP per head ratio of Southern Europe with that of Germany, we see that it currently stands at 69%, whereas in 2005, it was 88%. So in Southern Europe, the financial crisis of 2009 and the European sovereign debt crisis had a massive impact on the growth rates of these countries. Between 2009 and 2020, some of these countries began to show accelerated growth, such as Greece, Portugal, and Spain, whereas Italy's performance has been dire for many decades, and it continues to weigh on the overall performance of the Southern European region.
Thanks, Mario. And what about the other Eastern EU members and those countries that have not yet joined the EU?
So when we're looking at Eastern EU member states, we see similar trends as the one that we observe in Southern Europe as well. So what we're seeing in Eastern Europe is that the financial crisis also had a detrimental impact on economic growth there. It is partly to do with the way that the growth model of these countries is constructed. What Eastern Europe relies most on is exports and foreign direct investment, as well as a credit-driven domestic demand. What the financial crisis in 2009 showed was that this maybe is not the most sustainable growth model to go forward. After a few years following 2009, similarly to what we saw in Southern Europe, some of the Eastern European countries began to pick up pace and their growth accelerated. But then the pandemic hit in 2020, and we are now seeing some of these countries struggle to recover from last year's recession. Maybe what we saw between 2009 and 2020 suggests that what these countries need to invest in is more in innovation and domestic improvement of the business environment rather than relying overwhelmingly on FDIs.
Thanks a lot, Mario, and thanks a lot, Abhijit. We're at the end of the video now. Thank you for joining us today and for watching us today. Thank you. Stay safe. Goodbye.